is Positive Supports for Young Children with Challenging Behaviors. This is one of a series of live stream presentations that are aired on the third Thursday of each month at noon. We will keep it under 60 minutes. We will be using a chat box, so if you have any questions, feel free to chat us and we'll do our best to answer them. One thing I would ask is if you could please save the questions till the end. And if we don't get to your question, you can definitely call our helpline. I'll give that information at the end. Today's guest is Shahna Paul, Early Childhood Behavior Program Specialist at the NYC Department of Education. Shahna, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, Kpana. I welcome everyone to today's session on positive supports for young children with challenging behaviors, and I'm looking forward to our presentation and supporting families around this topic.
Okay, so I'm really excited about this topic regarding behavior because I'm also the parent of two children. One is 10 years old. He's a young boy on the autism spectrum, and I also have an 18-month-old girl. So I'm very curious to get into this topic. So let's get started.
So today's session is going to focus on positive supports we can provide our children to prevent and replace challenging behaviors. Things such as building strong and positive relationships with our children, teaching them how to manage their emotions, learning to understand what their behavior is saying, and helping them learn different positive behaviors and new skills to communicate their messages and to get their wants and needs met.
So, Shahna, what strategies do you have in mind for parents positive relationships with their children?
So when we think about building positive relationships with children, I would encourage listeners to think about someone in their life that was very special or important to them. And I would like you to recall whether or not that person was important to you because of how they made you feel. And when we talk about strategies, those innate natural strategies such as reading a book, taking the time to spend with your child, asking children about their day, letting them be your special helper, or just taking the time to play and talk with your youngster. This might have been some of the things that people recall when they think about building a relationship and what adult in your history you had a positive relationship with.
Okay. So now we're going to go into development and learning. So Shahna, I just want to find out what are the most important things that parents need to know about development. Okay, so they're not hearing. There's no audio. Okay. Sorry about the audio. Just give us a quick second. That's fine. Okay. All right. So what are the most important things that parents need to know about development, Shahna?
So the most important things are the ideas that learning and development follow a sequence and occur in a reasonable and predictable patterns. And it happens at varying rates. There's a wide range of typical development, and child development occurs best when children have secure and positive relationships, and that development and learning advance when children are challenged. And when we say children are challenged, it's about providing opportunities for children to do things just above their current skill set that they could be successful in with adult support, because we don't want to frustrate our youngsters. The other important thing about development and learning is that play is really the vehicle for learning and development, and this is the work of children, and play brings our children to that next developmental level and supports them in that process.
Okay. And when you hear about developmental age, what does that mean?
So developmental age speaks to where our child is on the path of development as compared to other youngsters for a certain age. So if we remember that development occurs along a sequence and a pattern of expected behaviors for certain age ranges.
Right.
Developmental age is where your child is in that course, as compared to chronological age, which is simply the year and date your child was born.
Right. And for me, I think the third bullet is really important because it says rate of development is unique for every child. And I think as parents, this is something that we really need to keep in mind because our children will develop at their own pace. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's get into the fundamentals of development. Right? So the second bullet talks about how development is a continuum. So a child does not suddenly stop being 3 and start being 4. So I know a lot of parents, including myself, would tend to forget this. Can you elaborate a little bit about the information here, Shahna?
So again, if we think about continuum and it's a gradual change, when our children have a birthday, they don't suddenly just jump across into the next age range.
Mm-hmm.
They move along gradually along a path. So
Right.
we again see there's a wide range of typical development, and there'll be some skills that are coming forward, some skills that need a little extra support.
Right.
But on our 4th birthday, we don't just start worrying about what they're supposed to do by the end of age 4.
Right.
We have to bridge that gap, and it's a slow progression.
Okay. So, and then also we see here that it says, although the rate of development varies from child to child, the pattern or order in which they learn skills and develop is quite consistent. Right? So this is something that we do definitely need to keep in mind as parents. Okay. So, Shahna, I would like you just to go a little bit into the New York State Early Learning Guidelines and just kind of give our listeners a little bit of an idea of what they're looking at here on this slide.
So this is a page in a resource that concerns families, the New York State Early Learning Guidelines, and it speaks to what the developmental progression looks like in the 5 areas of development. The resource for the website for this resource is available on the last slide in our resource section. So parents might want to look at this to think about where their child is in the developmental continuum, and it's also helpful to show what skill our children know today and what skill to expect that will follow, so we can help them advance in that area.
Okay. And one thing I want to point out is that you can get these guidelines for free at this website, and you can download the PDF, and they're available in English and Spanish.
So again, this slide here is also from the Early Learning Guidelines, and the most important piece is, if we see on the bottom of the slide, the Early Learning Guidelines offer sample strategies that can promote development and learning at each stage of development. So this is a nice starting point for families about how to build the skill set and help our children advance to the next developmental level.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I just want to address, someone is asking if we can provide the presentation. There should be a link at the bottom that you can click to be able to download it as well. Okay. All right.
So here we have another resource for families from the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and another opportunity to look at milestones or developmental progression. Again, they also offer throughout their brochure ideas for strategies to support children's development. And the website, this is a free download, is also available on our resource page in this PowerPoint.
Okay. And I just want to point out as well that this, I know on the screen it says your child at 4 years, but it goes from birth through 5 years old. So you can get information on the different milestones and on this website. Okay. So we've been talking a lot about milestones and developmental milestones. Can you elaborate a little bit about the roles of milestones?
So milestones help help us think about, how our child's learning and development is progressing. It gives us a touchstone about what to expect at certain ages or stages of aging. And it can give us a conversation piece about if we have concerns about our child's development. And it also can give us an opportunity to say that this is where my child will be moving next. So what can I do to help support that? Or if you see some gaps, how can we build some skill set there?
So now we get into behavior, right? Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by challenging behavior working for a child? Like I know in the last bullet it says children engage in challenging behavior because it works for them. So a lot of times when our kids are exhibiting challenging behaviors, we may not necessarily think of it as working for them. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
So when we think about the behavior working for the child, we have to take it from the child's perspective. So from the child's perspective, there is a payoff. The child is either gaining access to someone or something, or avoiding someone or something, or trying to get something or someone. So from an adult perspective, it might be difficult at first to see what that looks like, because we assume that maybe the child doesn't get what we believe they were seeking.
Right.
But in fact, from the child's perspective, there is a payoff. And as we talk more, we're gonna think about shifting our lens, about maybe trying to find some of those other details
Right.
that could answer that question a little better for us.
Okay. All right, so somebody's saying who is speaking. So this was Shahna Paul from the Department of Education. She just spoke, and this is Kpoto speaking now from INCLUDEnyc. So I see Jane Smith had asked who was speaking. Okay, so measuring behavior at home. So if you notice here on the left column, it talks about unclear, like describing the behavior in an unclear way by saying Joseph is aggressive or Romy doesn't listen. And then in the right column, it talks about describing the behavior in a more well-defined way. And I know often we hear that parents and teachers use unclear language to describe a child's behavior. I know for me as a parent, I'm guilty of this. Like I might say, oh, he's always running around, or he's acting up, or she's not listening. And, this is really an unclear way of describing the behavior. So, Shahna, what's the significance of ensuring that a child's behavior is defined clearly? Why does it need to be well defined?
So most importantly, it needs to be defined so that everyone involved with working with the child has a very concrete understanding of what the behavior looks and sounds like. The other reason is because if we don't have a shared understanding of exactly what behavior we're trying to prevent or address, it's going to be very, very difficult to identify strategies that are going to be effective. And then if we're not explicit exactly, also it could result in more challenging behaviors.
So, typically a child may be exhibiting several behaviors at once, right? And then as a parent or as a teacher, the challenge is trying to prioritize these behaviors. And as you can see here, the first one is safety. And I'll just give you an example about my son. So he needs a lot of redirection, especially when he was younger. And there was a time when I was taking him home from speech therapy, and I stopped for 1 second to get something from my bag, and he ran into the street. And it was just by the grace of God that the light was on red that he didn't get hit. So that was a challenging behavior, him running off. And I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to this. So that would definitely be number one when it comes to safety. That's definitely a challenging behavior that a parent would want to address right away. But Shahna, we have five different types of types of challenging behaviors here, right? So we're talking about safety, severity, frequency, and the impact on the child's learning and quality of life, and then the chain of behavior. How many can parents tackle at a time? Because it can be overwhelming.
So for that very reason that it can be overwhelming and is overwhelming for adults, and for children to try to address everything at once. So these 5 points on this slide are guiding questions that can help us make a choice. So when we're looking at multiple behaviors, the question to, well, which one should we work on? We say, how is this impacting safety? How severe is it? How often does it occur? The frequency, what's the impact on the child's learning and quality of life? And then the chain of behavior, very simply said, sometimes, and we know that our kids may start out with whining or pouting, and then it escalates. So when we talk about chain of behavior, it might start with something little and then the tantrum comes at the end, or the
Right.
running away. So do we want to, and we really want to address the behavior that starts the whole chain. So these would be the way to make that decision.
Okay. And I realize that, as parents, it can be difficult trying to prioritize what behavior to address. So I really hope that these talking points can kind of help to guide you as you're trying to decide how to prioritize. Because when you're in public and your child has fell out on the floor, on the sidewalk, or in the supermarket, you're also dealing with people staring at you and making comments. So it can be a lot to deal with. So I'm really hoping that this helps you to be able to make some decisions in that moment. So let's take a closer look at the behavior. This is like we're really starting to really delve into behavior here. Can you break down this slide for our listeners, Shahna?
So in order to address behavior effectively, you have to figure out why the children are behaving the way that they do. And that's, I'm sure, the big question. Well, why does he do it? Why does she do it? So we're going to look at some steps to help figure out, answering that question. So the first step in trying to answer the why is to look for a pattern in behavior. So we talked earlier about behavior having a pattern, behavior being predictable. So we're gonna look for those patterns. And part of the way that we figure out the pattern is about, we can think through it in what we call this ABC chart, which is a common term. So behaviors that happen over and over are happening for a reason and serving a function.
Right.
And that's the why. Why does he do it? Because it's serving a purpose for the youngster. So the first step here in working through this ABC chart is to identify explicitly what behavior we're addressing. Behavior, again, has to be well defined. Is it something we can see, count, or time, and that anybody reading our description about the behavior would be able to know exactly what that looks like? So that's why you see that the number 1 is in the middle column and is not to the left. So we always start with, what does the child do?
Right.
Okay. And once we figure out what behavior we want to address, the next thing that we're looking at is about what happens right before this behavior. So on the slide, it says antecedent. It's commonly called trigger. It's the same thing, a trigger and antecedent, but it's about what happens immediately before this behavior. Then we're going to look at, okay, what happens immediately after the behavior, okay? And again, that's where the function is embedded in that last box, because what happens immediately after, that's what the payoff is.
Right.
That's driving the payoff, or the function. Is the child, what does the child get or avoid? The most important thing. So we look at this over time. This slide just has like one sentence. It's very helpful to put it into a sentence when you try to think about putting the pieces together. But again, when we're looking for patterns, we're looking for patterns over time. So it's certainly not just based on one incident, but this is the thinking from the child's perspective.
So, Shahna, you make a very good point, because you said we have to, you're observing the behavior over time. So this means that as parents, we need to be more mindful and more observant. If we know that every time we take our daughter on the train at 6 o'clock, she has a tantrum or a meltdown, then we need to be a little bit more observant as to, what's happening before she gets on the train, what is causing her to act this way, and then what the payoff is, what happens after the behavior. So I think you make a really good point here. So what is your child trying to tell you? Poor guy, he's he's having a tough day, and I can totally relate to this. The only difference is my daughter lies on her back and screams. So this one is on his stomach. My daughter lies on her back and screams. But what is the payoff from? So we also have to think about the payoff from the child's perspective, right? Why do you think we should be cautious about assumptions that we make about why a child is behaving a certain way? Because it's very common for parents to make assumptions about why a child is doing something, and a lot of times it's deeper than that. So why shouldn't we make assumptions?
Because we're making assumptions based on an adult lens, an adult information, and it's from a child's perspective, so it's not in keeping, and oftentimes we're incorrect, and we know that we're incorrect with the assumptions if the strategy we use based on our assumption doesn't work. So if the behavior keeps continuing, but we're convinced that this is the reason why, but we're not seeing a positive change, then we have to step back for a minute and say, you know what, we might have guessed wrong. We guessed it wrong. So sometimes it's not always what it seems. We might think, a typical example might mean that, well, whenever he throws a toy or whatever, hits his sister or something, he gets in trouble. So that's our assumption, like, oh, the consequence is he gets in trouble, that he doesn't care if he gets in trouble. We're assuming he doesn't care, and we're assigning a lot to his, emotional wherewithal. So again, when we look at this slide, we have to step back and see that there's only two reasons why children demonstrate any behavior, or even for adults, is to obtain or get something, or escape or avoid something. And that's really important because there's no emotional overlays in those two choices.
So now we're going to move on to finding the meaning of the behavior. So you have mentioned how important it is to look for a behavior pattern. And I know in the moment as parents, we forget to be mindful of what happens to trigger a behavior. We tend to concentrate on the actual behavior as it is happening at the moment. What can parents do to get better at this? What can we do to make the best guess on the meaning of our child's behavior?
So again, if we think back to the slide that was up earlier with the ABC chart, you might use that as a guide to really think about what happens right before and what happens after. So here's a little scenario that listeners can reference before, because it speaks to the behavior that the little boy does here, and then what the consequence is. So he throws himself on the floor. His mother stops talking to her friend and picks her up. So, sometimes, here we could see that the consequence would be, the payoff is to get attention. That would be, the most obvious one here. Again, in real life, in real time, we're looking at patterns. So one little snippet does not make a pattern, but there's always a why, as opposed to he does it for no reason. It's really about being noticing the little nuances that happen before. So this is just another example here that parents can reference to work through it, because this is a lot of information. It's a lot about nuances and changing our lens and slowing down in order to go fast and go forward, because it's not about, in order to prevent it, we have to understand why it's happening.
And I just want to acknowledge, I know we've been getting a few questions, and I do see your questions, and we're going to try our best to address them at the end. So I just want to let you guys know that. Okay, so setting events. What can parents do to prepare for a setting event?
So setting events are, really important to be aware of because they're events and situations that set up the behavior to make it more likely to occur.
Okay.
And this is different than an antecedent because antecedent or the triggers are the fast triggers. Those are things that happen immediately before the behavior. But the setting events, those are the things that are the slow triggers in the background, like the risk factors. So if we think about the example you gave earlier about putting the baby on the train at 6 o'clock in the morning, what might that look like? Is there something different that today you're taking the train because you usually ride in the car,
Right.
but today you're taking the train? So we can't always prevent setting events.
Right.
Things happen, such as siblings are born, but we have to be aware that they increase the likelihood that the behavior will occur. So our job really is to think about what we can do to minimize or mitigate some of those settings.
So to kind of put this into context for parents, can you give some examples of some common setting events?
So the ones that all parents are experts at is, if your child is not feeling well, it's probably going to be a very hard day.
Right.
We know when our kids are cranky, they might, having an ear infection. That's a setting event. There's nothing we can't prevent it,
Right.
but we can mitigate it by saying, probably not the best day to have work on something that's challenging,
Right.
or start a new task. If another setting event, which, when our kids are sleepy, those are the obvious ones. They didn't sleep well, they were restless. But setting events too that to be aware of that aren't maybe as obvious sometimes is, a history of behavior. So for some of our children who are presenting with delays in their communication abilities. They may have learned alternative ways to communicate their message, which is more physical or behavioral. So as they have a pattern of using that, so that might be something that we have to undo a pattern, okay, that's been in standing for a long time, and build an alternative skill set.
Okay. So now that we've kind of gone through setting events, we have another example here of another child who's exhibiting some behavior. So you can kind of see how to work through why Maya is behaving the way she's behaving.
Yes, and these are just obvious things about, births or relative visiting, and then when they have to leave, perhaps. These things sometimes affect our children in difficult ways.
So addressing behavior at home. So I know this is something I actually was talking to a parent today in regards to her child's behavior at school and at home. So we do get a lot of calls in regards to behavior. So like it says here, when you're developing a plan, it's important to consider your child's abilities and limitations. Keep expectations realistic. What would be a realistic expectation, do you think?
So when we talk about knowing where our children are on the developmental level, that's what we mean about being realistic. So we have to really think, is this a reasonable expectation for my child? So, does my child truly understand what I'm asking them to do or asking of them truly means? Do they have the skills to build this capacity at this moment? Or are the skills emerging, or have they not yet developed? So if we think about, a physical example, if we want our children to perhaps put things away gently or gracefully into a container, we have to say, are there any known underlying, motor issues that may interfere with this? And that's why we have to really look at it as a team approach with our providers. So, they might not be there yet, but how do we build that capacity? Because we don't want to expect too much, but we don't want to expect too little
Exactly.
either.
Right.
And it's hard to know where that even middle is.
Yeah.
So I encourage everyone, reach out and collaborate with the team of teachers or related service providers who are involved with your children, who know them intimately.
So replacement behavior. So the previous slides we saw, Jeremiah and Maya, right? And then here we're talking about replacement behaviors, which have the same function as a challenging behavior. It's easier to do, is socially acceptable. Why is it important to look for triggers from a child's perspective? Because you had mentioned that before.
So what we're looking at from the child's perspective is what the payoff is.
Right.
And so sometimes, for example, if an example would be that we might assume that the child is snatching the toy all the time because he wants the toy. He's snatching it. But based on looking at it over time, we might have guessed wrong. And from the child's perspective,
Right.
snatching the toy might mean that the teacher comes over to talk to him, and it might be that he's seeking the attention.
Yeah.
So again, this is just a made up 3-word sentence, but that's why I say it's always from child's perspective, and the patterns will tell us the consistency. So when we talk about replacement behavior, if we want our children to stop doing something that they've been doing so long that's been working for them, we have to offer them an alternative that's going to get their same needs met, that provides the same function. They're still going to get whatever it is that they were seeking or avoiding it. And it really has to be easier to do, because that's a long climb to say, please do this instead, which is so much harder to do because it has to be really efficient.
Right.
And the reason why that matters is because if we're asking them to use their words instead of their hands, we have to make sure that it's serving the same function. Otherwise, the child's not going to adopt that behavior because their needs aren't going to be met.
So what would be a replacement behavior for a child who's using their hands instead of their words, do you think?
So again, I'm just making a gross generalization, and it's so child specific, and that's why we have to say, if we took, the most obvious would be, we would want a youngster to use language in lieu of using a physical means, but we have to check back. Is my child verbal? Where is my child on that? Because that might not be appropriate, if they're not there yet. So, so that's where we would look for that. Verbal communication would be the most obvious, but for our children that are not yet speaking, we have to think about what they can do instead. Right. Would that be sign language? Would it be a tap? And that's really a conversation to have with the family and the providers who are expert in that individual child about where that child's starting point is.
Okay, so setting event strategies. So as Shahna had mentioned before, she kind of went into setting events and what they are. So here we're going to talk about some strategies in regards to setting events.
So when we think about, setting event strategies, again, thinking about how can we minimize the impact, and parents are really expert at this. So sometimes, we'll do things like, we'll get up a half an hour earlier because we know today, I'm taking my child to school as opposed to, his grandma, and she gets his coat on in 5 seconds.
Right.
So we want to be strategic here, right? Parents are really good at that. Pre-planning, or all that, if you know you're going to move, it's heading down the line, how are you going to prepare for that? It's about being preemptive. And again, parents are really expert about being creative, but the idea is that setting events do impact the behavior more than we may think. So it's certainly something to think about when we're looking about prevention.
Yeah, and as a parent, I mean, this really reinforces the idea for me, to be more observant of my children's behavior and knowing what's triggering the behavior and trying to identify what the payoff is for them. So prevention, right? If it's predictable, you can prevent it. I think that makes a lot of sense when it comes to our children's behaviors. So can you elaborate a little bit about how parents can prevent some of these behaviors?
So, this slide is really speaking about the fast triggers that happen right in the moment. So, we can think about setting up our children to be successful and being able to coax them in that moment. So if you know that it's going to be a challenge for the two siblings to play with materials and that the little baby brother might take something from him, we would be mindful to strategize around that, however we wanted to set it up, but to be in very deliberate ways. So, if we know that when the baby brother takes it from him, he's going to, strike back, we know that. So how are we going to intervene in that?
Okay. So, here again, we're talking about prevention and planning ahead, right? So the tip here is to anticipate how your child may react or need in certain situations, and then plan ahead to support your child's success. So how can parents plan ahead to prevent challenging behaviors?
So things to think about would be incorporating a structure and a routine and that predictability. And again, that might be something that, when the predictable situation changes, for some of our children, that could be where the challenging behavior occurs. So again, if we know break in routine, breaking it down to little steps, or those the forewarners, the organizers from about what might be different, increase the chance for success. Really going slow and planning ahead, being mindful of those traditions. These are just gross generalizations around adequate time, providing, breaking tasks down, waiting for one piece. It could be very overwhelming for some of our, hurry up, the bus is coming. And, just that sort of, what does that look like for our children? Being very, very concrete as possible, simple and clear statements and short instructions to aid what's being asked of them, being consistent, just some gross things that, people have heard and the school, I'm sure, has shared, but it's really effective. Sometimes less is more, and to just be really efficient with our language. And I just want to point out, this one about reasonable choices. Sometimes we don't want to have too much choice. Sometimes that's overwhelming, but to offer choice in as many instances where we can, because it gives our children a sense of control. Control choice that clearly you probably wouldn't offer a choice for dinner that you didn't have, readily accessible.
And I know this might be a mind shift for some parents, because I know, some of us might have the mindset that if I say this is what you do, you do it, and there's no room for negotiation. But we may want to reconsider that if every time we're saying that to our kids, they're having a tantrum. So provide reasonable choices might be a way to go. So teach new skills, right? Why is it important to teach new skills to our children in regards to behavior?
Because if we want them to stop doing something, we have to give them a replacement. Because to say to them, no hitting doesn't tell them exactly what they can do instead, and we need to replace it. So when we teach new skills, we want to really make the negative or challenging behavior inefficient.
Right.
We want to teach a skill that's in keeping with the developmental, again, why we focused on that in the beginning and gave those resources. So we have to teach them what to do instead, because to say, don't do that, do this, whatever, but we're not taking the time to teach into all the nuances of that, they're going to default to the thing they've been using all this time that comes the quickest. So we really have to teach the new behavior in the same way we teach other skills.
And I think you have made a very good point, and I think I just want to highlight it when you mentioned that, it's important to tie the new behavior to the child's developmental level. So that's something we have to be aware of. So that puts more, like, we as parents have to be in tune with our children and how they're developing so that we have realistic expectations of them. So I know, sometimes we tell our kids, calm down. I know this example is something you have shared before, but we need to help and teach children what it means to calm down. Can you just talk a little bit about why this is important? Because we usually give a lot of instructions and directions to our kids. We're always telling them what to do. But what does it look like for a kid?
So again, being as specific here, when we're teaching the new skill, we have to really be explicit about what the new skill is going to look and sound like. In the same way, we have to define very concretely the challenging behavior that we are trying to address. And the reason for that is because general things like calm down, it's very unclear, particularly when children are upset, what that really looks and sounds like and feels like. So we have to be very, very explicit with modeling and showing about exactly what to do and when. Teaching the skills for problem solving and coping and calming, those are ways to replace a behavior. Sometimes, how do you solve the problem? If someone has something that you want, that's a problem.
Right.
So how do you solve it? And then we have to say, where is our child on that trajectory? A child that's 18 months old, we're going to look at it very differently than a child that's, 5 or 6.
Right.
And then within that, again, the most important and more important piece is, where is that child on that developmental continuum, regardless of their absolute age. And the early learning guidelines can be a resource in that regard about, so what do I do? How do I build if I want my child to work on problem or coping skills? Where's my starting point?
Yes, so those guidelines have some really good strategies that I think will be really helpful for parents. So, I really encourage you to download them. It is free. Okay, so now we're talking a little bit more about, new skills and how you teach new skills. When the third bullet, it talks about positive feedback, and how that can vary for each child. There will be some kids who, like to be hugged, and some kids like high fives. How can parents partner with teachers around this, and what does that look like?
So it's so important. Collaboration is very, very important, because the more consistent we are with our approaches, that provides more opportunities for our children to practice what the new skill is that we're focusing on, and also provides opportunity for generalization. So, yes, it's really important to get all those lenses together, because it may look very different at home because it's a different environment. So yes, collaborate with your providers, potentially ask to participate in the classroom activities and whatever family events are going on. And I just want to focus a little, add on to what you were saying about positive feedback. So the big idea when we're teaching new skills and alternative replacement skills is that the positive feedback that we give for the emergence and the developing of the new skill has to be so grand and much grander than the feedback that we give when the child is using the challenging behavior, the negative skill.
Right.
Because whether it's like joy and happy, or maybe we're using a more a different affect or tone when it's a behavior that's negative that we don't want to see, the idea is that the feedback for the replacement behavior really has to be consistent,
Right.
and much happier,
Right.
than the,
Yeah,
for the other one.
because I would think then that would encourage the child to want to do that replacement behavior.
Yes,
Right?
we're also building capacity. Absolutely.
So consequence strategies, right? So when it comes to replacement behavior, right, I would think it's more than just telling a child stop it, right? So just saying stop it or don't do that, that's not a replacement behavior, and that wouldn't be very helpful. But in terms of strategies, what happens if a parent tries these strategies, right, and it gets worse?
So you're probably on a good trajectory, because oftentimes what happens is the behavior likely will get worse sometimes before it gets better, because the child did not get the memo that that's not being reinforced anymore. So we call it an extinction burst. But it's the child only has that in their repertoire, so they're keep using it and using it. If I scream louder and longer, eventually it's going to come. So it will pass. So sometimes it is confusing that parents implement a strategy and feel that it's making everything worse. Again, and that's why I reach out and look at it as a community of providers, because that is a common phenomenon, and it might truly mean that you're on the right path. The child's just trying harder and harder with the strategy they've used all along to get what they want, or to avoid something.
Okay, so someone had asked to identify the presenter. So this is Kpoto speaking right now, and Shahna just spoke before me. So hopefully that helps.
And the other thing about replacement behavior is that it really needs to be reinforced immediately, consistently, and regularly, in order for it to be able to compete with the negative behavior.
So now we're talking. So remember, Shahna had mentioned that when that replacement behavior, when the child is exhibiting that replacement behavior, you want to be very positive and happy in terms of your feedback. So now we're talking about reinforce and reward expected behaviors. You want to catch your child being good.
And also, again, here, when we talk about being specific about the behavior, we really want to be explicit by saying things such as, nice hands to self, as opposed to good girl, which is very sort of open-ended and unclear.
Yeah, so this one is enlightening for me, because I'm always saying good job. Everything is good job, good job. So I guess I need to be a little bit more specific on why my son is doing a good job. Okay. So here we go. We have some new responses here. So it's important for us as parents to plan new ways on how we respond to our children's behavior.
So redirection is a popular one, and it's can be physical redirection, where we provide some like physical coaxing, a little tapping, to sort of guide, or verbal, but to re-engage the child in something else that's more appropriate. Verbal redirection can distract and provide an alternative. These are just some working ideas to prompt conversation and dialogue with the providers and your child's teacher and your other family members. These are things parents are very good at, offering different choices. And this idea of using first and statements, very simple statements like first put on your shoes and then go to the park. Different ways to change our language and slow it down.
All right.
So the questions on this slide relate back to one of the scenarios, but really, again, these are just guiding questions that you can have a conversation with your family and your child's providers around your specific child based on the behavior that you want to address.
So next steps, right? Things that you can try at home. So, we're just sharing some ideas here of some things that you can try at home. The first one, we talk about select a routine or activity at home during which your child has a challenging behavior. So this is giving you an opportunity to try to work through some of the things that we discuss here today. Okay. So we're pretty much at the end. We do have a few more minutes. I tried to write down as many of the questions as possible. A couple of people have asked about the early learning guidelines, and if you will see this slide, the top link, it says earlychildhoodny.org. You can click on there and you can download a free PDF in English and Spanish of the guidelines. And then we also have some other links here as well, and everyone is going to be getting the PowerPoint. So I try to keep track of as many of the questions as possible. So we have a few minutes. I guess we can try to get into some of them. So somebody had asked Shahna about, if it would be a good idea to have a cozy cubicle for a child who may have a tantrum in a classroom.
So again, a conversation to be had. Anything that is pro-social, preventative, and supportive certainly it is in a child's best interest. So it's hard to make general recommendations, but if we're trying to provide a safe space, that is a common alternative that has been successful and should be likely on the list of possibilities for a strategy.
Okay. Someone else had also asked, I guess they needed a little bit more clarification on what it means when we talked about a new behavior to replace the negative behavior. They needed a little bit more clarification on that.
So if we don't want children to kick to get an item, we have to replace the kicking with something else. What can the child do instead that's socially acceptable? So if we don't want our children to fall on the ground to indicate that they don't want to move forward or they don't want to participate, what can they do instead to protest or reject? Okay.
All right, so another question, and this has come up a few times. I see we have some providers on here. Some of them are interested in, what if you have a class of 12 and all 12 are exhibiting challenging behaviors? How do you handle something like that? I mean, I understand, it would be a general suggestion of feedback that we're giving you here. So if you need specific help in these regards, we can figure out as far as resources. So, Shahna.
So in a very general response, I would recommend looking at it, when we look at a classroom, we're looking at, yes, at all the children together. So we're looking at classroom-wide systems and structures. So what classroom-wide systems and structures that are in the best interest of all children, whether they have special needs, don't have special needs, challenging behaviors or not, are those best practices? What do those look like? And then to build from there. So there are universal things that are in the best interest and helpful for all children at certain, points in their life. And then we start building it upon that. It's very hard to answer in such a broad thing, totally. But looking at it sort of in a multi-tiered system of supports. Let's start with what we know is good for everybody who's little, and everybody needs this, and then we start adding based on individuals and small groups of children.
Okay, so I try to have as many of your questions answered, so I do apologize if we didn't get to your questions. I do encourage you to please call our helpline. I know we got, a lot of questions on here and feedback from our listeners, and we totally appreciate everything you have shared. Please definitely call our Include NYC helpline. Let me just get you that information right here. So this is our helpline, 212-677-4660, and we will try to connect you with any resources that you may need. And if it's something that's outside our area of expertise, we'll definitely refer you out. As we wrap up here, I just want to share about our next live stream that's going to be coming up. That's going to be on March 14th. I think my child has dyslexia. What now? That's going to be with attorney Andrew Weisfield and the Fordham University School of Law Family Advocacy Clinic. Shahna, I really want to thank you. This was really interesting. I learned a lot as a parent. And I'm hoping that everyone else was able to get some good, useful information. We will be sharing the PowerPoint with everyone. You can definitely download it. There should be a tab at the bottom where you can download it and you can get some additional resource materials as well. So thank you, Shahna.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for tuning in.